So I'd like to say, welcome to what is this, the December version, the 13th installment in the Textile of the Month group. And today we'll be talking about suminagashi. So let's get started. First thing I thought, if we're going to talk about suminagashi, we should talk about sumi, the ink, and talk about just exactly what it is and how it's made. It's soot. Basically, there are different ways of collecting it. This is a traditional company in Nara, Japan. According to their website, a lot depends on the thickness of the wick, the kind of oil that's used, how close the wick is to the edge of the vessel. All of those things affect the soot that's produced. They have these metal bells sitting over the flame, and you can see he takes off each one, scrapes off the soot into his collection basket. Now, this liquid he's using here, which appears to be in a copper vessel, is called nikawa, Nikawa. It's a type of gelatin. It's used for content and different kind of cooking things, okay? You could probably, if you wanted to try this yourself, is just use unflavored Knox gelatin. It would be close enough to try it. So here he's collected all of his soot. He's collecting it into basically a big mixer at this point. So now that the powder is there, he'll go ahead and pour in this nikawa that he's prepared. And take a look at the viscosity. That'll give you an idea, again, if you're going to try it on your own. Okay, and having poured all of that in there, he turns on his little blender. This will churn for an hour or two just to make sure it's thoroughly mixed. And once it's done, out comes this Play-Doh-like glop that he sections off. He's kneading it in more soot, like you'd need bread dough on a flour tray on a cutting board. And then to get it further mixed, you can see that he's working with his feet. He'll also be working with his hand. The point here is you really need to work it. Now, the idea of kneading it like this makes sure that every single particle is moistened, everything gets mashed against the other one, and you get the finest, most minute particles possible for the best quality ink. Okay, so once he's weighed out the allotted portion for that particular sumi stick, he'll go ahead and work it a little bit more and then place it into a mold. Okay. And you can see when he was kneading it before, he put it in soot, like, again, flour on a cutting board. You may have noticed a moment ago, he had a little vial of the nikawa sitting there where he continued to add, there it is down the lower left corner, add a little bit more moisture to it until it gets just exactly the right consistency. And again, according to their website, a lot depends on the humidity of that day, the weather, the temperature, the ingredients involved, what time of year it is. All of those things affect the quality. And he, as an experienced craftsman, is constantly monitoring that to make sure he gets it just right. They'll then take these sticks that they've prepared and dry them in ash, changing the ash repeatedly until it's almost dry, and then hang them up for the final drying stages. Now, I'm spending a little bit of a time on his knotting, but then I figured as fiber people, I'm as interested in how he's braiding these together as with the Sumi production itself. So I think it's a really interesting way how he's making yarn out of the straw and then is going to hang it up in the rafters to dry. Okay. You can see perhaps some of the calligraphy that's stamped into the different blocks there. That's from the mold itself. So these molds are the molds themselves are quite intricate pieces of art, being very carefully hand carved to last quite a long time. So now that you have that soot made, you need to prepare it properly. The stone he's using is called a suzuri, the ink stone. And the important thing here is to work slowly when making your ink. Don't rush it. Take your time, somewhat meditative state, and that will produce the best ink. Now, in this case, the artist is writing the character beautiful. At the very beginning of the talk, the artist had written the character for Sumi itself. The suminagashi, now getting actually to that, let me stop for just a moment. Getting to suminagashi, that wasn't developed for textiles originally. Initially, it was developed to print papers upon which calligraphy was then going to be written. Letters or calligraphy that you might want to frame would be on this type of beautiful paper. Now, the tradition is that there were women working in the shrines, okay, that had spilled some ink in water and then took a sheet of paper to blot it up and discovered they had this beautiful pattern. And that's the tradition for how this process began. So Japanese suminagashi is always on water, not on oils, not on thickened things, not on agar-agar as happens in some techniques. Okay, so it's simply floating the ink on water. For that reason, the ink is usually fairly thin. And because it was originally developed to print on paper upon which additional calligraphy was going to be added, the colors traditionally were never intense. So even on textiles, they can be very, very pale. Let me stop here for just a moment. This is a very shallow tray of water, okay? It's only about a ½ inch deep. Obviously, it's very level. It is just plain water, tap water. No ingredients have been added to it. So what you're depending upon is the surface tension to help create your pattern. And so when you drop, and I'll back up just a little bit here. Whoops, too much. There we go. So you can see what the artist is doing here. Several brushes are in his hand. He's tipping one brush in, barely touching the surface. You're not dripping this in. You're just touching the surface so it can splay out quickly. It can dissipate very quickly along the surface. And one of the ways to get that to happen is to add a surfactant of some type, something that breaks the tension. In dyeing, if I need my normal dyeing, if I need a surfactant to help dissolve my pigments, I might use rubbing alcohol. Okay. What this artist is using is just a couple of drops of dish soap. Dish soap will also break the surface tension, okay? So by breaking the surface tension, suddenly that little bit of ink spreads across the surface. And then you dot another one, and it spreads across the surface. And so in this case, the artist is making concentric circles of different colors or different intensities of color. Then simply by laying your sheet of paper on top, remember, it's just floating on the very surface, all of that ink picks up, transfers to the paper, and you have your print. Now, traditionally in Japan, they're using colors that were commonly available to calligraphers, and that's the Sumi ink. It's also the indigo blue type of Sumi ink, and it's the red type that you would use for your stamps and so forth. So those are the traditional colors normally used: black, blue, and red. It's often mentioned as red, but in reality, it's the vermilion color, not oxblood red, say. Okay. In this case, they're going along with sprayers, spraying along this entire trough. So this trough is the length of a bolt of fabric. Okay. They have very intense sumi on one side, very pale sumi on the other side. They've gone along with additional water and put drops to cause little spots to open up with the surfactant. And now they're going back with a comb to fine tune this image. You can see he's teasing the edges to cause the gray section to encroach on the darker black section. Now, I'm going to stop here for a minute. This is an important detail if you're interested in doing this yourself. Most of you will recognize the equipment. This is the standard hariten shinshi that we use in the katazome classes when you're doing your katazome. Remember the paper we saw being placed a moment ago. It needs to be flat. You can't just plop it down or it'll trap air bubbles and cause distortions in the design. So by using the hariten shinshi, you get a nice, even surface across the entire length of the cloth, absolutely flat. And then if you gently lay that down from the center and then let it spread to the edges, no bubbles are trapped. And you just pull it off and you're done, basically. Now, they don't say this at any point, and I've seen no mention of it, but I'll just say this here from my own experience. Sumi does stain. That's fine. Sumi has the gelatin in it that we talked about earlier. It has many things to help it stain. However, the blues and the reds and other colors may not. So what I would do is, having completed my textile, I would now apply a very gentle wash of soy milk over the top to seal it all in, if I were interested in doing that. Okay? Here they have a much larger trough for much wider fabric, using blue as the base this time. Again, the blue is sitting on the surface. She's spritzing in little drops of water here and there to displace the blue. It'd be nice to have a setup like this. Okay, and having done that, one other thing that's important to do before you put your colors down is to make sure there is no dust or lint or anything on the surface of the water. That'll change how your image turns out. So they're using wider width, harite and shinshi, and these are the kinds of results they get with just the simple blue. Okay. If you go back in and tease little sections, remember, this is just sitting on the surface. You do not want to stir anything. You might use a fan to cause a gentle movement. You might blow on it. You might sprinkle on it. You can do things to agitate just the surface, but never below, or you won't have successful prints. So here's a beautiful piece done. One of the things I'd like you to notice in this case, it's done on chirimen crepe. In addition to that, this whole section was dyed before or after, I assume it was done before, with a pale blue-gray color. And this lower section here was done with a very gentle purple. And then the marbling was placed over the top. This is the sample that was in your collection for this month. And what you may, if you look closely at your sample, it's not really pronounced. There are bits of the pink and bits of the blue. And again, that was in keeping with the traditional colors of the reds, the blues, and the blacks, which is why so more random pattern than the chevron type. It's just a matter of personal taste. We often don't think of stripes as being marbled, but this certainly is. Very gorgeous stripe pattern was created for that Haori jacket. This is from an obi, a fukuro obi. And what I'd like you to notice in the next detail is it's actually a woven piece. So when I say woven, the suminagashi is not a woven pattern like a tapestry. The suminagashi was done on gold-leafed paper. So you have a sheet of paper with the marbling on it. That in turn was cut, as you've seen done in other textiles we discussed earlier in the year, shredded, okay, and then woven into this pattern for the obi, allowing the weaver to have the actually easier method of dyeing paper, but still the strength and beauty of a woven textile. And then metallics can be included. Again, they'll need a binding agent, but you can include little bits of metallics in your piece. And this is an example of an obi in which the paper included metallics. It too was shredded and woven, as we saw in the earlier piece. Okay, so here's where we start to get a little bit more complicated in my mind. What we have going down the very center of this is the seam of the back of a kimono. All right, so we're dealing with kimono with fabric, as you saw in this example earlier. You have this whole bolt, which is going to be around 14 yards or so of fabric that needs to be dyed. And not only that, they have dyed in stages. Okay, so they've dyed several different stages on one bath with gray, on a separate bath with the brown, and they've calculated the match in the back plus seam allowance. Okay, so, but wait, like the Ginsu commercial, if you think that's not enough, you get all of these combinations of more. Whoops, let me back up a tiny bit. Going across the seam. So you have the brown, you have the black, you have the gray, all matching across this seam line. So there's a lot of calculation, a lot of technical expertise, and a lot of fun. I'm sure there was a lot of aggravation and frustration in developing this skill, but it's very beautiful. Okay. Now this one might appear to be matching across the seam, but it's not. That's just happenstance, of course. Let's back up from this. So this is actually the kimono I have in back of me at the moment. You can see the swirl here. Now, what I'd like to point out to you is this bottom division. This is not quilted or appliqued. This is all dyed on one sheet. You have the suminagashi on the top, and you have the sarasa style patterning on the bottom. Okay. And this is a detail of that edge I want you to see to make sure you understand it's not stitched and matched. So the question is, from a technician's point of view, which would you do first? Were it me, okay, I didn't do this, but were it me, I would do the marbling first and then go back over the other sections and do the sarasa. The sarasa colors are much more intense, much darker. It's easier to correct if there's a problem than, in my mind, it would be for the suminagashi itself. Suminagashi on textured fabric is difficult. It's much easier to do on paper, I think understandably. It's much easier to do on a satin or a China silk or a pongee or something with no nub, no slub, no texture. But many of the kimono I have are on chirimen, okay, which to me is textured. They're also on jacquards. And so you'll have the jacquard woven pattern, maybe of flowers or birds or something, and then on top of that, the marbling. So what that does is it gives a different element of shadow casting. The shadows are cast by the weave as the person wears the garment, but it certainly makes the dyeing much more complicated. And here again, in this case, this is actually, in my mind, less technically difficult or complicated than the piece we saw earlier with the 3 different colors of suminagashi matching. Now, the reason I say this is less complicated because it's only apparently one dipping of the suminagashi in isolated areas, and the area which was not dyed with the suminagashi was left exposed, and that's the point at which I would do the yuzen work. Okay, this may be either tegaki, hand painting, but more likely it's going to be a combination of hand painting and stencil, brush through the stencil, as in sarasa. And this is really beautiful. You get all of these different shades going on, but if you look carefully, it's still red, blue, and black, and a combination of some of those colors. So as colorful as this piece is, there are very few non-traditional colors in it. Then one more layer of technical interest is if we dye over a section. Because this is white in the center, we know that this leaf was not applied over the marbling, right? Okay, because it wouldn't be white here if there were marbling underneath it. I know you don't have the textile in front of you, but I have, and I can see it's not like white was painted and color put on top. Okay, that is the weave showing. So again, were I doing this, what I would do is find some kind of a thin something, frisk it. I could put a little bit of paste down maybe, as long as it didn't stiffen. You could put something to resist the dye. Okay, you could take Scotch tape, very thin Scotch tape, and cut out that shape and put it on your fabric. Then you do the suminagashi. Then you finish that up, pull off the tape, or something that doesn't leave residue, pull off the tape. You have your white area, and you can see this was stippled with a brush. Okay, so by cutting out a leaf, again, as you would for sarasa, you could then stipple through the stencil into that section. Okay. So here's an even more fun one. of the kite. So he was hand painted in after the fact, but the silhouette of this Yakudako style kite was all applied first. So to keep it blank, the suminagashi was over the top, and later the details of his mustache and so forth were painted in. Okay, and the same thing here. Again, from a technical standpoint, considering the fact that this is sumi, you don't need any white spots. This would be easiest to approach if you did the suminagashi in the back first, and then went out and back and did your sumiette type painting on top of that, because you can see the little bits of waves flow through behind the pine branches. Part of having these samples and part of this discussions in this textile of the month is I want to help all of us. It helps me too, to become trained to actually look at what's happening and do a little detective work to see, well, what probably came first? How would I do it? Doesn't mean you're right always, but it does get your brain stimulated in terms of how you can go back in the studio and produce this yourself. This is a piece I wanted to hang in back, but only the top would show in this case, so I went for the other one. The background here is not suminagashi. This is tataki type with either wax or paste. You can do it with either method. Whole series of tiny splattered white dots resist, whether the resist is wax or rice paste. And then all of that was dyed. Now the bottom part is suminagashi, and the trees themselves are stencil dyed, katayuzen style. Okay, so let's take a closer look at some of those, and you'll get a better appreciation, I'm sure, of the splatter technique. Okay, and this has a really wonderful feeling of trees in winter. So you'll notice here how the tree trunk here has been painted, but they've actually taken advantage of the resist and created white branches at the top, giving you a very cold kind of feeling. And as we follow the kimono down along the bottom, what we'll see is they've executed the same idea of matching across the seams, only in this case, they're not matching across one or two, straight lines. They're matching the flow of the pattern as if this were all one canvas. So when you're trying to match one or two spots for a crucial image, let's just suppose for the sake of argument, you had a large circle and you had to match that circle. Okay, the rest will go wherever it is if you're only matching one circle. But keep in mind for kimono construction, this panel goes all the way up over the shoulder and comes back down the other side with no seam. Same thing's happening here. So if your matching is off a little bit here, it'll be even worse when you get on this side. So again, technically exquisite pattern that they've done here. This gives you a better idea. Remember, seam allowance is also calculated in, and on this type of kimono, a side seam allowance is normally 3 or 4 inches. Okay, so much more complicated than doing a back seam match. Now, I don't actually know whether this was on purpose or not, but I also find it quite beautiful that this tree seems to be sitting in the middle of a little eddy created in the water flowing around it. And you can also see the silhouette patterned stenciled trees that were on the left there. So that's basically it in terms of the traditional methods for producing Japanese suminagashi. We're talking, just recap for a moment, we're talking about basically a water trough, very, very shallow, absolutely crucial that you work gently and allow the polarity of the surface of the water, the surface tension, to do the work for you. You can have the chevron patterns, you can comb it if you like, you can have very random natural looking patterns, you can introduce a whole range of colors. The thing is, the dye you use has to stay on the surface. Sumi ink naturally has that little bit of gelatin in it, which helps it stay on the surface, but there's not so much that it will wash out from your fabric later, the gelatin actually inhibiting the dyeing at that point, okay? So there's so little there, it's just enough to keep it on the surface. If you wind up using some of the pigment sticks that we've used in the dye classes, those are all things I carry on my website, but and the Sumi as well. But if you're using that, those already have a binding agent in them, a little bit like watercolors, have a binding agent in them that helps it float. If you're going to go out to your yard and get some dirt to make your own pigment, it doesn't have any of that in that. So test it before you attempt this, okay? Make sure it floats. If it doesn't float, add a little bit of something to it just to keep it on the surface and to keep it from sinking, okay? So that's your technical tip. Leaving that, this next piece technically is not suminagashi, but I like the technical idea of it. And so I thought this would be a good place to produce it. I mean, to introduce it. And I hope you're as fascinated as I am. I'll put the links later down in the information below once this is posted. So if you stop and look at this, this is very much marbling, right? It has the same kind of beauty and pattern to it. This is using synthetic dyes in this case. They're a little bit more zonker than the Sumi. But the way the craftsperson, the artist went about this is very interesting. Okay, this is the same rice paste we use for katazome. It's just very, very dense. And so here they're running it through tumblers to make sure it's kneaded properly. Synthetic dyes have been added to different segments, blended thoroughly, and those they've gone back and mixed. So let's stop for a second here. So you see all of his little palette of synthetic stained rice paste. All of his little colors rolled up here, ready to go. By running it through those rollers and flattening it, okay, they become almost like polymer clay. By then creating this little knapsack of colors and blends, he can run that through this same tumbler, this same wheels again and again. And what that does is if you run it long enough, you get great, right? But if you run it less than that long, you start getting these colors mixing in oddball swirls and eddies to create this. And when he goes and slices it in half, you wind up with all of these individual sections of color. He's taken this large flat knife and he sliced what came out from the tumblers in half. That gives him the core of this blended set of colors in a very flat surface. Now, if you remember, this is rice paste resist with a color in it. Okay, it's water-based and the dyes are water-based. So now if he moistens the surface very gently, that moisture will soften the paste, soften the dyes, and act as a print. And so you can see now the colors that are in this piece of paste he's been working with, okay? So if you go with that premise and you start making these segments that he can print with, you start to get all sorts of different floral patterns. So taking that bar he had in his hand a minute ago, slicing it up, assembling these now into a shape, you wind up with segments of that little cinnamon roll, okay, that are then shaped to the image of the flower or whatever it is you're producing. So to do that, you go back and draw a cartoon, cut out each segment as he's doing here as if you were doing pieced quilting. And let me, back up again. Okay, notice now what's happening with the flower and these segments. So this is a segment he just cut. He's arranged it so that the ochres are towards the centers. Some of the reds are more towards the outside, but he has this jigsaw puzzle piece, this piece quilted combination of shapes from which to print. And here you can see there are various flower petals. He's been able to line up the flow of the suminagashi somewhat. You want to maintain that beautiful marbled look, but it's still lined up a little bit. And you can see the green section entered here, the yellow calyx in the middle, and so forth. Okay, so that's what he's doing as we speed past this. So Those cinnamon roll slices, okay, that he had a moment ago have been attached, and when printed, look like this test sample. Now, when you take that test sample, you start to see, okay, where does this fit in to my cartoon? So, just like with piece quilting, you now have this great big sheet with all your little jigsaw pieces together, a little bit thick because of the paste. And that's what you're looking at here. This is the thickness of the paste. He's now taking that entire sheet and transferring it to a tumbler, a roll, so that it will create one cylinder of pattern. So see how he's putting that in there? A little bit of water helps to stick it. That's the whole roll. So now there is rice paste resist with the color all the way around this tumbler as a repeating pattern. That gets dropped into the printing section. The tumblers start rolling. Notice there's a little bit trickle of water up here to moisten everything, to keep the paste just damp enough to transfer. You don't want so much water the paste is going to reconstitute and become gummy. Just enough to get that surface of the color transferred to the silk. And you can understand that this also has its tension as you're working, because once the tumblers start, you need to keep going. Okay, so everybody's running around to make sure everything's working, but I want to take a moment for you to see this absolutely fascinating setup that they have to do these bolts of fabric. They're doing this for Hermes style scarves. Okay, this is an order for them. And this is what you get as it comes off. The reason I'm showing you this, besides the fact it's a fun technique, is when you're looking at suminagashi, there are some commercially printed, meaning printed like any other textile is printed, okay, and aren't actually real suminagashi, not hand done. They're still beautiful. But if you're not sure if you have a real one or one that has printed, what you look for is the repeat. And because this is on a cylinder, and because it's turning, and you get the red flower one go around, next go around, that red flower is repeating. Now, the red flower might not be exactly the same every time, because the thickness of the rice paste is wearing down and the swirl is hitting in a slightly different place. But the point is that red flower is in exactly the same spot every time. So if we were to isolate this little, what would you call it, a pale blue finger shape, okay? Then if this is a tumble printed piece, we should be able to find virtually the exact same thing up here as a repeat. And not just the finger shape, but the other finger shape above it, and the dot, 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 dot should be a dot, dot, dot up there. Now, when you take a comb and you disturb the surface of suminagashi, you do get very similar patterning, but you'd never have a case where you have exactly the same dots in the same repeat. They'd be very similar, but never exactly the same. That way you're sure you have a real piece. That's why it's important to know the techniques involved, because they help you understand better what exactly you have in your collection. Aren't these quite beautiful? Okay. Thank you. That covers all that I had to say about the suminagashi, and we'll go ahead and stop this portion of the YouTube and go on to our group discussion.